Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our third session of the Peterson Foundation Economic Forum. This forum brings together thought leaders for in-depth conversations on America's most pressing economic issues. Our initial three-part series is focused on the policy implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, exploring ideas for safely reopening the economy, and how effective fiscal policy can both aid the fiscal recovery and prepare us better for the next crisis. We kicked off this series in June in conversation with CBO Director Phil Swagel, followed by a session in August with Dr. Michelle Williams and Dr. Harvey Feinberg that focused on the U.S. healthcare system's response to the pandemic. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome two distinguished economists to discuss the economic impact of the pandemic, how policymakers have handled the crisis thus far, and what this all means in the campaign. There's obviously plenty to talk about. As we sit here today, the election is just 24 days away. The nation remains in the midst of a pandemic with rising cases in hotspots around the country. The economy is certainly in terrible shape by any definition. Nearly 11 million fewer jobs exist today than did before the pandemic. We have huge uncertainty in sectors like hospitality, food, travel as the winter season approaches, and millions of families struggling to make ends meet. The policy landscape is equally uncertain. The last relief legislation was passed in April, and many programs expired in July. There's actually agreement that there should be more relief legislation, but there's no clear path ahead for agreement on the size and scope. In terms of the federal debt, it's rising rapidly. Our national debt eclipsed $27 trillion last week. The deficit for this year will be $3.1 trillion. While about $2 trillion of that is for the pandemic, another tragedy is that we were going to run trillion-dollar deficits no matter what. So our structural deficits are firmly in place as we entered this period. According to the CBO, the next 30 years, we will have trillion-dollar deficits every year and growing due to these structural factors. So while dealing with this crisis is certainly the current priority, once this is over, we need to address the paths of our debt for our future economic health and our overall preparedness. So clearly, we have no shortage of complex and critical issues to talk about. I want to welcome these two gentlemen. Lonnie Chen is the David and Diane Steffi Fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution, among other important roles in academia, and is a veteran of several high-profile Republican political campaigns. Austin Goolsbee is the Robert P. Gwynne Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He previously served as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration. Lonnie and Austin are both distinguished economists with significant experience across government and academia, and we're very lucky to have them here today. I will ask a number of questions myself, but we would welcome the submission of written questions from the audience. So to submit a question to the panel, click on the blue circle at the bottom of your screen with the question mark at the bottom, and you can submit your question. So we don't have any agreed upon rules for this bipartisan conversation, but it's nice to be in a discussion where we know the questions will actually be answered. So we're looking forward to this. Let's bring on Lonnie and Austin. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Well, let's just start with some basics about the economy and how you're looking at things as we sit here today. Let's start with you, Austin. How would you describe the current state or shape of the recovery, and how connected do you feel the health recovery is to the economic recovery? Meaning, do we really need to get through this pandemic before we can really get the economy back on track? And what are the interconnected issues there?
Yeah, I think everybody can see, for themselves that there's a snapback. We had a horrible downturn. We've had a snapback, pretty rapid in part of the economy. That's been concentrated among higher income occupations, people who could do their job from home, people who have to do their job at a physical location. It's been a lot longer slog. I don't know what shape that is, some kind of an Arabic script shape. And I think my number one rule of virus economics that I've been saying since the beginning of this is the best thing you can do for the economy is anything that slows the rate of spread of the virus, because it's the first recession we've ever had that was caused by something that had nothing to do with the economy. And if you could stop the virus, then and only then Will stimulus work? Will any of those things work? Until you get control of the virus, and I have some economic research with data on 2.5 million different businesses and consumer visits to those businesses. Until that happens, you will see overwhelmingly people's individual fear of catching the virus will continue to depress economic activity. And it's not about lockdown. It's not about the policy choices of the president or of Congress or of governors or of mayors. It's about, on the lockdown sense, it's about, can you give people confidence that we have this situation somewhat under control? And if you look at countries where they have done a better job getting it under control, they didn't have nearly the kind of negative labor market impact we had, and their economies are poised to snap back in a better way than ours has.
And when you say things won't work, I mean, the stimulus legislation, the relief legislation, you would say that had some positive effect, though, right, during that period. So
yes,
when you
but
say
it
work,
wasn't stimulus. The only thing that I object to in that statement is it was a relief bill. It was not stimulus. Stimulus is a thing of the form government spends money to try to get the economy to launch on its own, a jump start, and it becomes self-sustaining. That's not what this is. What this is the furnace is out, and in order to prevent freezing to death, we're going to burn money to stay warm. And you can that will work. That will keep you warm as long as you keep shoveling money in. And that's our thing. You can't restart the furnace unless you control the virus. And the CARES Act was critically important to keep people from getting evicted, to keep food on the table, to keep companies from liquidating. But we should not kid ourselves. If we do not control the virus, the CARES Act costing in the trillions, that is the run rate for life support of the economy. It's going to continue to be in the trillions until we get the furnace back going.
Got it. Lonnie, tell us your thoughts on the current state of the recovery and these issues.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I did want to clarify one thing in that very generous introduction, which is that I'm not actually an economist. My training is not in economics, although I have observed and interacted with economic policy a lot in my career. So I just wanted to be clear about that, since I think folks who've earned that title should have that title.
Let me just say thoughts on the economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me just say this. I agree completely with Austin that the backdrop here is how people feel about the virus. And as long as the virus is not contained, as long as people don't have the psychic certainty around what's happening with the virus, I do think it's going to be very difficult for us to get back on track. I think the current conversation around, will Congress do more in recovery legislation, that is somewhat, it's not that it's irrelevant, but we're going to continue having this conversation until we have a more steady base to depart from. The observation I would make, the biggest concern I have about how this economic downturn has affected the American people is the degree to which I think the effects are disproportionately felt by people who are at the lower end of the income distribution. I think people who have been working in retail jobs, in hospitality jobs, folks who don't have the luxury of working from home, who can't translate their activity into the home as easily, people who have childcare needs. Frankly, those tend to be disproportionately clustered at the lower end of the income distribution as well. Those are things that concern me about what we've seen. And I think that any activity that we look at going forward needs to recognize that this is a recession that has not been felt equally by people across the different parts of the income distribution in this country. That's just the reality of things. And the tragedy of this is that we're restarting in fits and starts, but there are elements of this that look like cart before the horse for me. So one of the things that I think policymakers need to give some thought and need to get right is this issue of school reopening, which continues to be a big controversy in so many parts of our country. If we don't get that right, it's going to be very difficult. You've got parents who, I know parents in this area who are having a difficult time with childcare, who don't have steady internet access. they have to leave their kids or they have to drive their kids to the parking lots of local public schools so they can learn. That's unconscionable. So we've got to figure out a way to get that turned around. And that's going to be a big part of this piece of how we get the economy back to where we want it to go again, because it is absolutely the case that this is a recession, this is a downturn that really had very little to do with the fundamentals of the economy and a lot to do with an awful pandemic that we have to solve.
Okay, well, you're obviously both in agreement of the connection between the two, and I want to talk a little bit about response legislation. But let's fast forward to the pleasant day where the pandemic is behind us, the health crisis is behind us. What are we seeing in behavior that might linger beyond that date? We've seen a lot of changes in how we all interact, business travel, cruise lines, theaters, et cetera. What do you both, starting with you, Lonnie, what do you both feel about what could be going on now that might persist even post the health crisis?
Yeah, a few things. First of all, I think it's possible, in fact, likely we'll see consolidation in travel and in retail and hospitality. It's going to be very difficult for us to see the same kind of competitive landscape because it's just hard for some of these smaller players to survive, given what we've seen already. So I think some of the after effect will be consolidation in some of those industries.
So you think it'd be hard for them to survive? Sorry, you think it'd be hard for them to survive in the post-crisis environment? Or obviously, right now, it's incredibly difficult.
I think in the post-crisis environment too. I think the crisis environment has created such pressure that it's going to be difficult to imagine that some of these entities. I mean, I'm just thinking about. There's been a lot of conversation, for example, about the airline industry, which the U.S. airline industry was already fairly consolidated. And I would anticipate going forward, it's going to be difficult to continue to have the same number of carriers that we had in the pre-pandemic period, and even during these last several months when there has been relief or recovery legislation to try and support the industry. I think it's going to be hard. Beyond that, I would say some of the trends that we've seen around working from home, around the value of online education in some cases, I think some of that integration will remain. Look, here in the Bay Area where I live, you've got large employers that account for a significant part of the economy here who've basically said, we're not going to have people back in the workplace for the foreseeable future, probably not until next summer at the earliest. And so some of those changes, the way that we have gotten used to some of these things, I do think remains. Now, once we have better therapeutics, once we have a better sense that we have a vaccine that's working and is deployable and scalable so that people can get access to it, that may begin to shift things back. But the notion that we're going to be in the same world as we were pre-pandemic, I don't buy that. I do think that a certain element of work from home, a certain element of technology in the workplace, in the school, that is here to stay. And I think that the last thing I would say from a policy perspective is I don't think that any future administration is going to see the concept of pandemic preparedness quite the same ever again. I think there will be much more of an effort. I would hope there'd be much more of an effort to bring to bear strong leadership on coordinating response, economic response, educational response, public health response to pandemics. Because while COVID-19 was not predictable in the sense that we didn't know where it was going to come from and what form it would take, the idea that there are pandemics that can affect us and really affect us in such a fundamental way, I don't think was something that we couldn't prepare for. And going forward, hopefully there'll be more of a mindset around needing to be ready for those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Austin, what do you think about the post-crisis economic environment? I think we're all looking forward to some of the good things that we learn in this period, but that may have lingering economic effects, right?
Yeah, we're going to have a lot more pets. Everybody's adopting a COVID puppy. I think it was interesting that last thing that Lonnie talked about. I wasn't formulating my mind. I think he's right that we probably will have much more pandemic and broad health scare preparedness going forward than we've had now. I sadly think we're going to look back and learn a bunch of negative lessons of whatever you do, don't do what the U.S. did in 2020, when faced with that. But I do think on the public policy side, you'll see some of those. My general view is that too much can be made of the permanence of the things that are happening during COVID. And my mental break where I come down on the side of yes, it will last is those things that accentuate longstanding trends, I think will continue and be permanent. But in my view, there are a bunch of things that are going against longstanding trends. And it's a little contrarian, but I basically think most of those are going to reverse in it, depending how long this lasts. And so I give you the example first. You've seen a mass movement of people out of large metro areas to more rural places and to smaller metro areas. And you've seen a bunch of people saying, is this going to be the death of the big metropolitan areas? And is New York City doomed? And things like that. If you plot urbanization as a share of the population in the United States for 200 years or in all the rich countries of the world for a very long time, you've seen absolutely continued urbanization increasing over that entire period. Because when we are together physically, our productivity is higher, our pay is higher, and that's why big metropolitan areas have been big winners for 80, 100 years in a row. I think once the pandemic ends, but fingers crossed, if it ends, please God, let it end. When that happens, I think we are going to start to rediscover pretty rapidly why we moved into cities to be around each other the first time, which is we're more productive when we do that. So I'm a little less, I expect a little less permanence to the everyone working from home. And I think ones where it goes in the direction that we've had are things like inequality. I think Lonnie's exactly right to highlight that there has been such a disparate impact. And that impact is very much in keeping with these trends in inequality of the last 30 to 50 years. And so sadly, I kind of think the damage done there is probably going to be permanent.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the relief legislation to date. Okay. I think lessons learned is important. It's not too early to start learning lessons. Lonnie, tell us about how you felt about the components of the prior legislation. You've brought up this disparate income effect and the effect the pandemic had on these more difficult, disadvantaged communities. Did it sufficiently address that, or at least attempt to, and how successful was it on that issue and the other important areas of relief?
Well, I mean, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a giant gaping wound. I think it's better than not trying to stop the bleeding. Obviously, you've got to do what you can. And some of these programs, have been effective at bolstering small businesses or giving them a lifeline until reopening began slightly more robustly in some parts of the country than others. And some of these businesses are doing a really the Herculean task of adapting to capacity controls. I'm thinking of restaurants in particular, capacity controls, indoor dining restrictions. So some of that legislation, whether it was the Paycheck Protection Program, elements of the CARES Act, enhanced unemployment, I think all of that was necessary at the time. I think I question, we do another 1.8 trillion is the number we're hearing from the White House today. We do another 1.8 trillion, it's another pack of Band-Aids, but really it does get back to some of the fundamental questions we were asking about before. And the challenge also is this, which is that a lot of different pieces had to work right to allow the recovery legislation to do the maximum amount of good. And unfortunately, we've seen some breakdowns in the system. So, if you look at the unemployment piece, for example, there have been a number of stories about how states haven't been able to keep up, or states haven't been able to process claims in the right way. There's a huge backlog in the state of California, for example, that goes to a lot of inefficiency at the Employment Development Department here. So the challenge is really when you enact that legislation, there are elements of it that provide direct assistance, and that's fine and all well and good. But then this disintermediated assistance, I think, has been much more challenging. And then the question is, if the system was broken in the first place, do you want to put more money into a system that's broken and not getting the money to where it needs to go anyway? So I think we've got to take a good hard look at what are we trying to do with more recovery legislation? Are we trying to make people feel better? Are we trying to provide a temporary bridge? And really, we've had some time now to intelligently analyze what worked pretty well and what maybe didn't work as well. And we should take that opportunity to really think about what needs to come next, as opposed to trying to do something to make us feel better politically, or to provide political advantage to one side or another. And that's what I worry about. This ongoing recovery conversation seems much more about politics. I mean, this is not unusual for Washington. I'm not saying anything that's like crazy or novel, but the fact that it's focused more on politics and really what's the right policy to begin to dig our way out of this.
Mm-hmm. Where do you come out on the state and local support question, and what level that should be, and should that be included?
Yeah, I'm not particularly sympathetic to the notion that we ought to have huge bailouts for states and localities. I mean, I look, for example, again, just to use California as one example, there's plenty of tax revenue there. In fact, the amount of tax revenue coming in California reached record levels in recent quarters. So I don't think, in some cases, in some states, it is a concern. I don't think universally it's a concern. And the fact that we're having such a big fight over several hundreds of billions of dollars, and if that really is what hung things up, that's disappointing. Because in my mind, that is not the key issue. That is not the key concern in this particular situation. I would prefer a much more targeted set of relief that would effectuate the kind of impact we want, rather than having a big conversation about bailing out states and localities. By the way, speaking of pre-existing trends, some of these trends about states and localities having issues pre-existed this pandemic. And the notion that we would use this pandemic now as an excuse to create these bailouts, I think, is deeply problematic.
Okay, Austin, what are your takeaways from round one in terms of lessons learned, and how do you apply that for the next round potentially?
Well, let's work backward. I guess I come down totally on the other side of the question of, should the federal government be providing support to state and local? I think philosophically it's obvious. Why do states have their own debt capacity that is separate from the national government's debt capacity? It's supposed to be so that individual states could choose. If California wants to have more pensions, more whatever, they can choose their own tax rates, they can choose their own pension contributions, they can float their own debt. We don't have state level debt capacity to deal with national shocks that affect all the states. That's quite literally exactly what the national government's balance sheet is supposed to be addressing. And so in this thing, there's no denying that the COVID crisis has applied a massive universal onto those states.
I think we're having some connections issues with you there. Would you just speak up again? Can see if we can hear you. You got cut off for a second.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. If you could back up like 20 seconds, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll back up 20 seconds. Did you hear I had a whole philosophical riff. Did that come through?
The philosophy of why does national debt exist? It's because separately from state level debt. State level debt is intended for state budgets. Okay, yeah. So here we have a national temporary shock, not unlike a war. That shouldn't be. You should, in World War II, you don't go in and say, "Hey, Wyoming, we're going to need you to put this on the Wyoming balance sheet, your contribution to pay for the national war effort." The national shocks, they should be put on the national balance sheet. If you don't want to subsidize the pensions or what have you of different states, that's a choice about what magnitude, how much should each state get. Maybe it should be proportional to population. Maybe it should be proportional to how many cases they had and not be related to what their pension obligations were before the crisis. But the idea that the federal government should not be putting this on the federal balance sheet, that we should be putting it on higher interest rate balance sheets of individual states, to me doesn't make any sense. In the CARES Act, in a kind of a classic Washington way, the Washington way is, we can't decide what the proper worldview is, so let's give everybody 25% and we'll just make a deal. Okay, so the CARES Act
They get massive applause for moving quickly, but it was 4 different things. Okay. It was money to everybody in those stimulus checks. It was specific money to people who had lost their jobs through the UI system. It was lifeline to small business through PPP, which is kind of temporary, but some of it was at least grant. And then there's a massive large business lending facility that can go up to $5 trillion. I'm more sympathetic to the give the money to the people, because my conception of what's happening is we're trying to use this money to prevent freezing to death until this crisis passes over us. This is not basic investments. It's not stimulus. It's largely about relief. And so I'm more sympathetic to give it to the people. The farther we get down the chain and the closer to the let's give subsidized loans to massive companies that already have epically low costs of capital and can access public markets, I find a little confusing. I'm not that surprised that there hasn't been as much take up of those lending facilities as they expected. And the singling out individual industries, I think, is potentially a bad idea. So to say we're going to have general rules for everyone, but we're going to just come up with $50 billion to give just to the airlines, I worry about what's the framework for that.
Lonnie, what's your reaction to some of that? I saw you nodding a little bit around targeted state and local to really specific virus-related issues and counts. Do you have a little more opening for that type of
I mean, look, the state and local thing, if there were a way to this was the point I was making, if there were a way to calibrate the aid so that you're not essentially subsidizing what I think are bad policy choices at the state level, then great. Let's have that conversation about what that aid looks like. There's no disagreement in principle that certain states and certain localities have suffered disproportionately because of high case counts, because of the need to react, because of massive expansion in Medicaid rolls. I mean, those are all things that are understandable. But what I object to is the sort of blanket notion that we've got to do more to bail states out. I just don't think that's right. With respect to targeted aid, I'm in agreement that it is most preferable to help, for example, individuals who've had economic displacement. It is helpful to look at businesses, particularly the smaller businesses that haven't had capacity, that have needed to or access to capital, that have needed to have that assistance. I think that's fine. But the conversations that we're hearing about now, to me at least, it feels like the scope has gotten broader than some of the more specific elements that I think Austin and I would agree on are important. And I think we have to be careful that these conversations don't grow into something beyond what they're not. And by the way, I think there are some very specific needs still in the healthcare sector. There are still some very specific needs where I do think further recovery legislation would be warranted. I do think that there's, again, on the small business side, there are still individuals who are economically displaced. So there's a lot of things we can do that are more specific. And I think the question is how much of the conversations around those specifics versus some broader forms of relief that I don't think are appropriate in the context of the current recovery conversation.
All I would say to that is that's kind of in spirit feels like the don't go too broad. And I think by far the bigger danger at a moment like this is that you go too narrow. And so if you look at the magnitude of the economic shock that we're facing, it is the biggest shock that we have ever had. In a short period of time, this is bigger than the beginning of the Great Depression, the worst year of the Depression, 1932. The unemployment rate did not go up in the year 1932 as much as it went up in a single month in response to this. So I guess Lonnie and I probably differ a little in if you're going to make an error, should you err on the side of being more targeted and specific, or should you err on the side of let's try to provide enough relief to match the size of this thing? I'm much more on let's get some more money out to people, because the loss function, if you want to think of it that way, is so much higher chance of permanence if you're too small than if you're too big.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about our fiscal future. As you know, that's the mission of our foundation. Before this crisis, we were supposed to reach debt to GDP of 100% in 10 years, and we thought that was a problem and something to begin addressing. Unfortunately, as a result of all this crisis impact on the economy and the government spending, we're not going to reach that this year. And then as the recent CBO report, as I mentioned, it predicts trillions of dollars of deficit every single year and going forward. So we all would agree the current crisis is the priority, but post-crisis, how do we know when it's time to start to return our attention to this issue? What would you look at to say, okay, now is the time to maybe address some of those issues? So Lonnie, starting with you, how do you measure our ability to go back and actually try to address some of these long-term challenges?
Well, the long-term challenges don't get easier the longer you wait. That much is sure. So, I think part of it will need to be, what is the appetite of policymakers? I mean, so far it's been non-existent, but hopefully there would be some appetite as we move, a couple of years beyond this. But I'll just say that one of the challenges is that in addition to the additional fiscal expansion we've seen because of the coronavirus-related relief packages, you now also have there have been a number of different analyses that have come out recently that have looked at the proposals of policy plans for both presidential candidates. And both of those suggest, actually, interestingly enough, similarly large amounts of spending over these next several years, a little bit more for the Biden plan than for the Trump plan, according to a recent analysis. But I do think that there is we've got to be a little bit smarter going forward. I mean, recovery legislation is one thing, but then thinking about what's going to happen going forward beyond that, the notion, for example, that we would create a public option in healthcare, that strikes me as being sort of taking things in the wrong direction, being sort of somewhat irresponsible, actually, as you think about what's happening going forward. So it would be my hope that we can return to address some of these questions sooner rather than later, but recognizing, it's probably not appropriate to do it in the immediate short term or even, over the course of the next, as I said, year or two. But I would hope at some point we've got to recognize that this problem doesn't get easier as time goes on. It gets a heck of a lot harder. And so we've got to begin to think a little bit about what that return to some kind of normal pathway looks like, because right now we have really broken, our pathway is broken, even from what we saw CBO's estimates were last year. The most recent estimates, as you note, reflect some significant increases because of what we've had to do because of coronavirus. And now we're going to have public policy on top of that that further exacerbates the problem. That does concern me.
Okay. I'd like to hear from you, Austin, on it. I'm going to pull in a question from Francis Hoffman. Are the guests concerned that interest on the debt will crowd out public investment and harm growth? So our rising interest tab, obviously interest rates are extremely low right now, but even with these low rates, we're looking at $4 trillion over 10 years. Do you see a concern about how that would impact public investment?
Yeah, some. I mean, I always say that the problem of deficits in the debt is not, for the U.S., is not that it's going to drive us into a fiscal crisis. It's that you have to pay back the money. So eventually, the question we should be asking is a generational kind of a question. Is it fair that people born in 1950 are going to pay substantially lower taxes as a share of their lifetime income than kids that are going to be born in 2025 are going to have to pay? That's the kind of thing that's the proper question to think about. I think for the foundation, to the extent that there are some people that care a lot about the deficit and have a tendency to say, well, we better do something this year or else we face ruin. I kind of think the events of the last 20 years have largely made that a bit of a crying wolf thing. And so now they have a harder time making that argument. I think the Republicans, I'm optimistic that if the interest rates remain low, which I think they are going to remain low, that definitely gives substantially more breathing room. And I think the debt capacity of the U.S. government is vastly in excess of where we are now. So as I say, I don't foresee fiscal crisis. I am pessimistic on the politics of this issue because the Republicans have multiple times in a row now taken a position about deficits and flipped it on its head once they got into power. And the arguments fighting about the deficit in the Obama administration, only to within months of the Trump administration, those very same people vote to have an unpaid for $2 trillion tax cut. I think there's no way around the fact that Democrats this time are not going to, if the very same Republicans get up and say, oh, but the deficit is so critically important, now we must stop anything that a new president wants to do if that president is a Democrat because of the deficit. I kind of think they're just not having it. And the issue of investments, which I think the public option or infrastructure, those are two areas that the COVID crisis has demonstrated. We have a deeply screwed up health system where millions of people can lose their jobs and thereby lose their health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. It makes no sense. We're the only advanced country in the world that has such a feature. So I think that it is pretty close to inevitable, in my opinion, that society is going to view more health coverage is part of the safety net, and we will just need to get rid of those high income tax cuts in order to pay for that. But I think it's perfectly appropriate.
Lonnie, do you want to respond to that? And how do you see he sort of framed the debt as a moral question, as an intergenerational question, more than a interest rate or crowding out question. Do you think that has merit?
Yeah, I mean, as a matter of kind of who it will ultimately impact, I think he's right. Clearly this is a question about tax rates in 2050, not tax rates in 2021 or 2022. I guess where we differ slightly is the notion that somehow you can just get rid of these tax cuts for the wealthy and that's going to alleviate the challenge. I mean, we've done some analysis at Hoover that will look at kind of what the impact of a public option proposal would be in the long run. We don't have to get into the details here, but it's not something that simply saying we can wave a wand and pay for it with tax cuts for the wealthy. I just don't think that's going to address the challenge. I do think he's right that I think Republicans have behaved irresponsibly over the last couple of years when it comes to this question of those who care about fiscal discipline and fiscal responsibility have either been shouted down or they've changed their minds. And I think that's really unfortunate. I will just add one last thing, which is I don't think the public cares any less about fiscal responsibility and the deficit and the debt. I think if you ask people, actually, as it turns out, I've looked at polling recently, they actually still express that they care about this, that they care about these issues. I just think that they end up taking a back seat now to other issues that have predominated. But people, if you ask them sort of, is this an issue you care about, you think government should be concerned or dealing with, they still say, yes, it is. And policymakers, the reason why policymakers aren't responding to that in the way that maybe they did in the early 2010s, for example, it is largely because of the fact that there are other issues now that have predominated. And I think that doesn't mean that the issue isn't important anymore. It just means, as I said, I think in the period we're in right now, in the space we're in right now, it's not top of mind.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left. I want to ask, Elizabeth has a question about millennials. You both brought up the next generation. How has this economic crisis impacted millennials who went through another recession in 2008, and what policies can be targeted to help out this group? So both of you, or Austin, you first.
Well, it sucks. I mean, it couldn't be worse. They lived through the Great Recession, which we said, wow, this is the worst thing since the Depression. And as with climate change, now it just seems like every 2 years we have the biggest flood in 100 years. Now we have an even bigger recession that's going to affect them. Look, I think by far the most important thing, and the place we have to start, is you got to get the economy back going. And by that, I don't mean we should repeal all the lockdown orders. By that, I mean, you've got to get control of the spread of this virus so that people can go back to work and feel safe about it. And by doing that, the good news is the millennials are the most educated generation that we've ever had. They're the biggest generation we've ever had. They have amazing ambition. If you look at the performance and innovative potential of this generation, I'm quite optimistic that we can get back on a path of some progress. I do hope that we don't lose sight of how important this investing in the skill base is, and that we address some of these issues like lingering student debt challenges, the cost of higher education, and stuff like that. The kind of, as I say, the sort of public investments that historically have served the U.S. growth rate well. I hope we do not lose sight of those kinds of investments because we say, oh, geez, we don't have the money right now.
Okay. Lonnie, do you agree that it sucks?
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, look, I think it's been a tough go, not just with the Great Recession, but with what we've seen recently. I think there are a whole host of policies. I think there is definitely some public investment that we've got to continue to make. I agree with Austin in that regard. I would say this: I think there's also a number of different things that have not been on policymakers' radar that probably ought to be. I do think that the millennial generation, from my experience, is people I interact with are deeply concerned about the climate crisis. I do think something will need to be done to address that element of it. I hear frustration around a broken immigration system still. And that's another thing. You talk about contributions to growth and contributions to an American economy that's durable and made to last. I think we've got to have a smarter immigration system. And since the 2000s, there really hasn't been an appetite to do very much there that I think is productive. So I think we've got to do something there as well. But ultimately, it's been a tough time, absolutely. And I think public policy has become more and more intractable over the last couple of years. We've become more polarized, and all of that doesn't bode well for addressing some of these big challenges.
Okay, as the last question, I just want to pivot to the election and get your thoughts about that. Normally, the state of the economy has a huge impact on the election. People assess an incumbent president by how good the economy is. In this case, it's a bit different, right? This is not a cyclical recession. The economy was in great shape coming into the crisis, but the devastation, as you said, Austin, has been historic. How do you, for the 2% of people that haven't made up their mind, at least, how do you, Austin, you first, and then Lonnie, you can have the last word. How do you think people will think about economic issues as they head to the polls?
Just as a factual matter, there has never been anything like this, so we have no historical precedent to look at. So if I told you there's going to be 11 million people out of work, you would say, wow, the president is going to be in big trouble. If I told you that we would have been adding millions of jobs a month, you would say, ooh, the president is going to be in good shape. And then if I told you that there are massive other factors at work, like what will be the fate of democracy, voter suppression, the pandemic, that make it so that nobody's even paying attention to the economy, you would again say, what kind of election is that? So fundamentally, we have no model, we have no data that will tell us that. I'm a Democrat. I have been an outspoken critic of President Trump and his management of both the virus and the economy. But I really think that his administration has proved to be a menace to the economy and a menace to the public health of the country. And there's 210,000 people dead because of this virus. And I don't see that there will be accountability for that. And so I think it's going to be a tough environment for an incumbent when you're coming out of a pandemic that people think you mismanaged.
Okay, Lonnie, what is your view on how the economy will impact people's voting?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? If you look at all the public opinion surveys, what they tell you is that, if the economy is the issue, notwithstanding this period of time we've been through, which has been very challenging for the economy, President Trump is seen as being the stronger candidate. And people give him, in some ways, the benefit of the doubt on that. If you ask them the question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Interestingly enough, there's some recent data from Gallup that suggests, a majority of people will report that they are. And I'm not, that's what the data says. I'm not saying that that's indicative of what's going to happen in the election, because Austin's right. It depends on the frame through which you see this election. If you see this election as a referendum on President Trump's handling of COVID-19, very, very slim reality, very slim chance that the president gets reelected in that frame. If there's a different frame, if the frame is, something that's more around who do you think is better equipped to handle the economic recovery over the next 4 years, I think it's a closer election. I don't know that that frame is going to be predominant for too many voters. You're talking about a low percentage of undecideds. I think that's true. And I think those undecided voters are largely going in with this sort of fundamental question, which is, maybe they like a little bit more the concept of Trump policy for the next 4 years, but they're uncomfortable with Trump, the person. And so they're trying to figure out how do they square one thing with another. I think that's really predominantly who the undecided voters are at this point. And so the frame through which you view the economy, the frame through which you view the election, whether it's primarily through the COVID lens or through a different one, I think that's largely going to control. And at this point, I think the reason why the president is doing poorly in a number of these polls has to do with the fact that most people are looking at it and they're thinking COVID and they're thinking referendum on COVID response. And I think that, unfortunately, for the president has not been a strong suit of the last several months. So, it's an unprecedented election. With that, I will agree. I think the factors and the things involved are going to be unlike anything we've seen before. So it makes it very difficult to predict.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end on. Lonnie Chen and Austin Goolsby, thank you so much for participating in our forum today. This has been a great conversation. Some nice areas of agreement, and certainly agreement on the assessment of the current situation. And in 20 days, we'll find out the answer to my final question. Until then, stay safe. Thanks for your participation. And we'll see you at the next episode of the Peterson Foundation Economic Forum. Thanks so much.